My name is Roopa Singh. Preferred pronouns are her, she, but them and they is fine as well.
So, Roopa, you're so many things. You're an attorney, a poet, an academic, currently working towards your PhD, a mom, and a yogini, and the only person from the South Asian diaspora to serve as an expert advisor to the Yoga Alliance's Standards Review Project. That's so many amazing things. Can you please talk about your path to becoming a yoga teacher? How did you hear and heed that call? And was that call strengthened given the commodification and cultural appropriation of yogic practices in the US today?
First off, I believe there might be one other South Asian American person involved in that process now. But yes, when the Yoga Alliance Standards Review Project began, I was the only South Asian American person or South Asian diasporic person involved. And in terms of my path to becoming a yoga teacher, I'm of course very much still on the path of, towards liberation. And that's really what it's about. It's not, for me and for others, the idea of becoming a yoga teacher is in itself a fundamental mistranslation in the past that is a result of not just commodification, but the processes of imperial relations that proceed through commodification, through propertization or making things property, or through classification and making things easy to reproduce and sell. And so the yoga teacher process of the 200-hour certification, or then the 500-hour after that, is very much a concocted process. That's not to say that it's thoughtless or careless. There's obviously thought and care that's gone into the thinking behind that, but it is still arbitrary, at least in relation to the ways of yoga and yoga as it has existed in the world for much of human history, whereby the path is one that is lived and experienced day in, day out with each breath. And so yogis were on a path similar to any very disciplined, say, martial artists or monks. These are not, basically, these are not designations to be messed with. It's sort of easy to come to a yoga teacher training now, but the path of the yogi is anything but simple or easy. I'm very much still on my path. I don't only identify as a yoga teacher in large part to adjust for the mistranslations or the processes of imperial power that have affected how we think about yoga and experience yoga in very fundamental ways. I identify as many things. You listed some of them very kindly. I also identify as a survivor of sexual violence in the home. And my experience of childhood trauma to my body meant that I was always seeking methods of coping. And a lot of my coping had to do with not doing much with my body. I needed to be still. And as I grew up and began to be on my path to becoming a lawyer and going to law school or studying popular culture for a master's and then the PhD, all those things require you to be quite still. Like studying for the bar, it's just no joke. You're day in and day out just still. And that's when I started to feel this the way that things that I once used to cope could really begin to get in my way and hinder my process and on my path to liberation. So when I was in law school in the Bay Area, I began to attend yoga classes. And then when I moved to New York City, I did a yoga teacher training while I was in school for my master's. And that's after I had adjuncted as a professor in political science for several years. And I went back to school kind of as a self-care mechanism to press pause on that really busy grind of adjuncting. And so that's when I did the yoga teacher training. But while there was a lot to unlearn in my home, I did grow up in a family that I learned a lot from as well, lessons that I hold dear. My parents were born and raised and married and had my older sibling in India and then immigrated after that. We always had some religious or spiritual experiences on a weekly basis, including sometimes 24-hour meditation and philosophical readings at home, religious philosophical readings at home. So, for example, reading through the whole Bhagavad Gita or something similar. We would host those things at our house, and we would also attend other people's homes, home-based spiritual gatherings where my mother would sing call and response spirituals called bhajans. And I grew up going back to India every couple years of my life to see all of my extended family, 99% of whom still all live in India. And all of these things exposed me to different yoga ways that I hold very dear as part of my everyday life, not as something that I go to class to do only, but as something that I try to embrace in how I walk through my life and breathe through my life. A lot of the seeds were planted early on, and I grew up understanding Hinduism as a guide, but not a like a defining thing that's exclusive of other religions or other philosophies. I grew up on stories of Hinduism and practices that all felt very inclusive, very accessible. And I know that's not the experience, impression or experience of Hinduism for many now. So in answer to the question about how commodification may have accelerated or inspired my path, so yes, definitely that I began to organize other yoga teachers of South Asian descent because of all of the odd and strange power dynamics I was experiencing as a yoga teacher and student. I was a collected member of a busy Brooklyn wellness center, and I was teaching yoga quite frequently and just in those circles a lot, and attending all different sorts of yoga classes, from Bikram yoga to forest yoga in various boroughs. So I had a lot of experience across the board, and what I found was not unique to me, but it was unique in my own life experience, that my being Indian in the yoga sites was a thing. It was all of a sudden a thing. And all of a sudden in the yoga site, I feel and felt quite marked by my racial and national diasporic identity. And those experiences ranged from often being the only Indian person in the room when a yoga teacher would say fake an Indian accent, or have a given Indian name or Hindu name. And all these sorts of things are just really like minute examples of a larger condition in the yoga site that is the result of really many, many hundreds of years of imperial power still circulating. And I think anytime there's something that's so powerful, it can be used, you know, for good or for chaos, for peace or for chaos. And, you know, it's not surprising that yoga, a very powerful set of tools and sciences, is being used in many ways to affirm things like whiteness, white supremacy, affirm US supremacy, affirm patriarchy. You know, it can be a haven for those who are healing from violence, and yet it can also be a haven for those who are not healing from violence, who are not there to heal from violence, but there to perhaps affirm their image of themselves as being good, regardless of the effect that that person and the systems they believe in are having. Yoga can be used in many ways, and for a long time it was held very dearly and much more secretively because of the power that those wisdom holders knew would be present in the transmittance of this knowledge. And I think we're seeing both the wonderful benefits of this knowledge spreading, and also some of the fallout is very present. So the last thing I'll say about commodification, propertization, which is turning everything and anything into property that can be bought and sold and also can exclude others. Commodification, propertization, classification, which is the process of kind of like naming things so that they fit into colonial systems of organization and replication. All of those things are present in my experience in yoga, and none of those things are new. And they're not only present for me, but through organizing with other South Asian diasporic yoga teachers, it became very clear that, you know, many of us are having this conversation, and it was important to get public with it.
Thank you. That response was so profound and so deeply thoughtful. I'm really grateful. With the ever-increasing pace of life and the huge amount of hatred and destructiveness that exists in the world today, and as a mom in a PhD program, how do you attune inward and sustain your daily spiritual practice in your life and in your child's life?
One of the ways I'm trying to do that is to be okay with the way that I can engage with my past now. So that sounds pretty simple, but I can definitely spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of emotional and spiritual energy fighting where I'm at, or not being aligned with my particular present moment. And so one of my best practices right now is to just try to be okay with what I have, and not pining too much for the past or the future, but just being present and feeling I'm feeling a rising belief in the miracle of the present moment, all the various miracles that come together to create this present moment. I find this is another thing that has to do with tuning myself like I would tune a guitar. So another one of the strings on that is just trying to be okay with having enough and being in a relatively peaceful place compared to so many in the world. And that can also take a lot of emotional space if I allow it to. to think about all the suffering in the world, and to not just think about it, but to feel about it. Sometimes it can create a feeling of feeling frantic. I can start to feel frantic in response to all of the suffering in the world. But I do know that as a currently working class woman of color, first generation American, single mom, I'm not slated for an easy path. And I do have my own relative sufferings to, deal with. And there's something in there that's valuable. Sometimes it can feel trite to just say it's all relative, but there's something in that relativity that is very valuable for me, so that I don't dishonor the suffering of others by just sitting here feeling guilty for the relative peace and enoughness that I do have. I do endeavor to see these things as a gift that we deserve. We don't deserve them exclusively. Everyone deserves them, but that we deserve, my son and I. So that's another string that I tune into to refuel or to stay balanced. The first guitar tune way that the first guitar string that I tune to be in my daily practice in a balanced way has to do with being present and not pissed about my current mobility, both how I move through the world and also how I move in my body. The second guitar string that I tune or try to tune on this path has to do with trying to stay balanced around our relative peace, especially in relationship to the suffering in the world. The third string that I would say that I tune has to do with quietude. I've been really curious about how to strike a good balance between staying informed about things that may affect our mobility, such as racist travel policies, anti-immigrant legislation, etc. I'm not sure about this balance of staying informed and also fostering quietude and protecting myself from violence. Violence in so many forms, including in the form of alarming narratives that are unfortunately part of the almost mandatory daily media diet of us all, especially in this country. Another thing is that I let myself rest. I'm trying to let myself rest more, but I let myself rest, and every time I do, it's an act of immense belief and resistance and self-care. So I think resting, especially for people who are overwhelmed with responsibility, is a revolutionary act, just like Audre Lorde said about self-care in general. I think self-care is a word or an expression that could use more unpacking, because it obviously has to mean something really different for each person. So there's not like this one way that we can talk about self-care, but that third string of quietude in the midst of the rising chaos, or just in the midst of chaos, seems to me to be very important. A lot of people don't experience quietude almost ever, and some of that has a lot to do with coping. And that can include being addicted to being social, at the expense of our own wellness, or always being on the phone, or always having your ear pods in. This is not to be judgmental of, for example, being a music lover or loving your podcast or talking to your people, meeting new friends and being social. It's just that for me, as a working mom in a PhD program, a single parent, I find that I don't have that much free time. And with the time that I do have, I really need it to be as peaceful and pretty much healing and meditative as possible. One of the ways I sustain our daily spiritual practice is through laughter, through fun. You know, making room for having fun is a act of avenging and resisting, fulfilling our, I think, ancestral hopes and dreams for us. The act of having fun and having moments of feeling carefree and laughing, moving in our bodies. We move together to have fun. It's one of the surest ways for both of us to break out into a smile, is to be running or walking or chasing each other and things like that. It's really, my little one is 2, and his deepest belly laughs since he was 1 and since he could walk has been being chased, basically. And he just strikes this like deep, deep delight in him. And I love it. And I was just reading an article by my dissertation advisor. My committee chair is a formative scholar, founding mother or world-renowned scholar of Indigenous studies. Her name is Dr. Loma Waima, Chanina Loma Waima. It's called Mind, Heart, Hands. And in it, she talks a lot about research, especially researching the lives or words of her area of specialties, Indian boarding schools, the boarding schools that Indian children in this country were forced into and forced to assimilate through in order to survive. And that meant shedding many layers of their Indianness. And she ends this article, Mind, Heart, Hands, with saying, humor is not necessarily disrespectful of tragedy. Laughter can be a medicinal thread that stitches together thinking, feeling, and doing. Laughter fixes the world, even as we struggle with violence. In this last paragraph, she also poses the question, how do we do violence justice? And then she says, what a thought. And, you know, just a few sentences later is when she says this about humor and laughter. And I think this is one of the key parts of my justice practice, is to keep trying to alchemize all that's heavy into lightness, so we can be around, you know, for as long as possible with as little suffering as possible.
The next question reflects back to some of the things that you shared in your prior response. Why is it important for us to integrate body-centered or movement-centered practices into our spiritual and political practices, you know, in accordance with the abilities of our bodies and what our life allows in the moment?
For me, my experience of life under capitalism has been one that really emphasizes almost exclusively my mind, at least in those settings that offer professional attraction. That has meant that I've been very still in a lot of the work that has placed me in elite context of scholarship and access. So I needed to integrate body-based, breath-based, movement-based practices into my life, because I had let those be marginalized by myself, and then they were forcibly marginalized by the systems that we operate in, that I live in. When I'm in my body, in these, like, let's say yoga asana, I am, I guess I'm more whole. And when I'm more whole, I can hear more of my wisdom. I can be more present to myself, witness myself more. All these things make me safer, more strategic, more focused, because of my current circumstances, needing to be so agile and pivot from role to role and responsibility to responsibility. Now, I do want to say that there is some scholarship that exists that has identified body-based activism as being somewhat of a bastion of white feminism or white supremacy and feminism. So we know, for example, that in Nazi regimes, there was an emergence of, or there was a centering of bodybuilding or body-based mobility and strength and those kinds of contests. And of course, with eugenics, a lot of it boiled down to, body-based ability. I just want to recognize that I do see that yoga asana, that the movement-based practice of yoga can be used that way as well, and is being used that way to affirm white supremacy or affirm various kinds of supremacy. My own lived experience of just moving in the world, like say going for a hike with Ravi on a mountain or what have you, I often find myself being the only person of color, or certainly the only single mom I see in these kind of outdoorsy or fitness type of spaces. And I do experience white aggression or male aggression as well in these spaces with some regularity. So I think all humans benefit from being able to be in their bodies. Being in our bodies allows us to be, is part of being present to ourselves, and does push back against a capitalist system that would sever us from our bodies in the name of labor. Being in our bodies is important, and it does in its own way reject the severing that capitalism requires, as Audre Lorde so eloquently wrote about in her essay on the erotic. But that same practice of movement-based activity or being in our bodies is one that is very powerful and is not the domain of any one race or gender or identity. And it itself can be used to affirm injustice and unjust hierarchies. So in and of itself, it is good, but it is not always inherently a good practice. And the reason why I want to make this distinction is because in yoga spaces, or just in the world, I've seen many people and heard many people talk about their yoga practices and identify with their yoga movement practices in such a way that it seems that they feel that these practices absolve them of any potential of racism or anything. That somehow the yoga movement practice is like a wooden confessional in an ornate Catholic church, and they're absolved upon exiting the class or after doing their yoga practice, or somehow being able to do the splits at 65 means that you have, led your life in a just way. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. And yoga is not a cleansing of anyone's, let's say, less than present justice or injustice-based beliefs. Yoga asana is often removed from the larger science of yoga and the larger practice of yoga as a life practice. There is a scholar, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who articulates a definition of racism whereby she says that racism is differentiated proximity to death, so that those who are further down the ladder in the racial hierarchies are in closer proximity to death, and those who are higher up are in less. You can think about this with, say, a working class or poor community that is positioned next to a toxic chemical plant, and their proximity to that plant places them more at risk of unwellness, generational unwellness. And perhaps many of those people work in the homes of another community that is many miles away and upwind of that place. And that community is a wealthy community, and that wealthy community will likely be a lot healthier. So this is all to say that, yes, movement-based practice and body-based practice is a wonderful way to be present to self, to balance out against the demands of capitalism that would place many of us just within our minds and values our minds, or values our bodies in a way that treats us as disposable, so undervalues us as individuals. And at the same time, the importance of this movement-based practice is different for everyone, especially different based on where we are on these ladders of justice and injustice.
Somewhat connected to that, for those of us who are not South Asian, especially for those of us who have white skin privilege, what are some ways that we can practice yoga and benefit from the fruits of the practice while challenging or even working to transform cultural appropriation and white supremacy?
This question is one that I really wish that I had more clarity around in terms of answer, because it is one of the questions that I encounter most frequently these days. To be honest, like from people who email me based on previous advocacy work, like I realize now that when I gathered that first panel of South Asian American voices in yoga, it was the first time in American history that that's ever happened, in world history. And I didn't realize that at the time, that it was going to be foundational. And I'm still sort of working to catch up to myself around that work. But based on that advocacy, I still get a lot of communication from South Asian people in the diaspora and also white folks doing yoga who want to know the answer to this question, or who are, trying to talk about it. So I'm actually doing moderating a session on this exact question coming up at an annual conference at Arizona State University called Local to Global. And this is the motivation, is to discuss this question with a mixed race group of people, because it comes up so much. And my initial answer is like, I wish I knew. I wish I could tell people. But I am so occupied with my long list of responsibilities and obligations that I can only barely have time to figure out how to keep myself balanced rather, much less than think about how how folks with white skin privilege can do this without causing harm. So that's the first answer, is I just don't know. But the second thought that has occurred to me has to do with the desire to not cause harm and its relationship to being present to violence. The way that I witnessed whiteness in yoga, at its extreme, it has a lot to do with running away from all of the violence that accompanies white supremacy within white homes. And I find that white supremacist systems really silence any truth telling about the violence of white homes across class and region. This desire not to cause harm, I think, must be coupled with a desire to embrace and do justice to the violence that people have experienced and experience as a part of their everyday lives with white skin privilege. So some of the things I've very witness to about white homes and childhoods have to do with being commodified as children, like, for example, being very aware of how much they're costing their parents, so that they experience their relationship with parents as very transactional. Like, I know of a deep inability to be intimate, to share an intimate love in a healthy way with all family members of white friends that I've had. And those are just two examples, but I think that the lack of, for example, of intimacy makes yoga movements, asana, very alluring, because these practices are very sensual. They are of the senses, all the senses. And we make sound in asana, and we move our bodies in certain ways. And I think, some honesty with self about why there's a desire to not do harm, coupled with honesty about the harm that has been experienced and the harm that is being done, is important. Unfortunately, many people with white skin privilege, especially who are wealthy, but there's no end to the harm. I don't know what it would take to not do harm, but I don't think that it's as possible as people might think, especially if it doesn't begin with grappling with all the violence too. Like, begin with that and then include that and move with that. How can whiteness not cause harm? This is a very interesting question, not one that I can spend too much time on in my own life. As someone who daily experiences racist, gender-based, class-based, ability-based harms from people who appear to be white. I'm teaching a class right now called Introduction to Justice Studies. Our main text is The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And one of the first discussions that emerged had to do with Fanon as someone who advocates for violence. Now, this man dedicated his whole short life to being present to violence, both in the colonial families and in the colonized families. I mean, in the colonizing families and the colonized families. And it just seemed to be such a knee-jerk or reactionary and very shallow discussion about, is Fanon advocating for violence, or shouldn't he be nonviolent and things like that? And I've been thinking about how to respond. I haven't, I moderated the discussions that week, but I would like to respond more, because it seems to me that that kind of reaction is somewhat in the same vein as this frequent question about how to not cause harm in the yoga site. And both of those things don't talk about violence. And it comes back to Dr. Loma Wayama's question in the article: how do we do violence justice? And I just don't know, but I think it takes it. We will all benefit from considerations of this question. I am curious about it. I'm curious about it too. But I'm not just curious about the question. I'm curious about, that is to say, I'm curious about the question more so than the answer. I make time to go grocery shopping, and if I had less mobility, I would start to utilize online ways of getting groceries to me. I find that having food to make, even if it's simple, is very healing. Also, between tasks, I always make sure to do one thorough cleaning of my bathroom and my kitchen, which I consider to be the core arteries of our household, so that they are, guest ready. Like when you have someone come over, there's like a different kind of cleaning that you do than when you just make sure that things are good for yourself. So, I treat us as guests in a way in our home, that is to say, like in the Indian way of the guest being a very honored member of the home in that moment. And I find that taking time to clean between big tasks really gives me mental clarity, spiritual space to reset, and also feel, gifted, like feel myself to be capable and loved. It's a way, like cleaning, like for example, cleaning my dishes, say at night, and then the next morning I wake up and I'm like, yo, who did that for me? That's so nice. It's one of those things that feels like such a gift to myself, because those seem like pretty mundane things, but especially when you spend a lot of time at home, they really make a difference. I shared about keeping food at home, especially groceries and like foods that I can cook and alchemize. I find cooking, MC, to be a lot like humor, in the sense that it really does create an alchemic, it's transformative for me to cook in very small, everyday ways. It's literally transformative in the sense that you take these ingredients and make them into something else. But the time I spend doing it is just calming and nice. And I find that the more I'm able to humanize myself in the processes, even in very small ways, that creates the doorway for me to keep moving and to accomplish these tasks that I've never done before. Like if I sideline myself, I'm not going to be able to get shit done. Not these days, not that way, because I'm already at capacity. So if I sideline myself, I veer into near burnout so easily. And I find that I have to humanize myself in the face of these processes that really encourage, say, graduate students to humanize themselves, to live haphazardly at the expense of themselves, to create and to produce at the expense of their lives. So I can't do that. That's not where I'm at in my life. And I keep discovering that all the time. So of course, because the system is designed that way, and because I grew up marginalized, severely marginalized, traumatically marginalized. I, of course, am always learning this.
If people would like to contact you because they're interested in inviting you to a public speaking engagement or learning more about your work and research, how can they contact you?
The best way to contact me is by email, and that's at S as in Sam, A as in Apple, A as in Apple, P as in perfect, Y as in yellow, A as in apple, at gmail.com. So that's SAAPYA@gmail.com, SAAPYA. And I just ask people to be patient with turnaround time, which can vary. But yeah, that's the best way to reach out, and I welcome that.